Welcome, everyone. Peace and love from the Atlantean consciousness. This is Grandmaster Dr. Thor, Templar. And I'm going to do a kind of a book report here on a fascinating little book, but an important book in terms of the world that is true Southern witchcraft, and something that there's a huge amount of confusion on for a whole bunch of reasons. Doing research is very, very tricky, and the whole idea is when you get sources of information, how can you give them credibility? How do you look at things? How do you interpret the information? And you can look at things from an arrogant point of view of dismissing things. Oh, these idiots don't know nothing. You can look at it in the gullible factor of, oh, yes, this is fact, man. Wow, I've been looking for this. And, I've seen this kind of attitude from people, and this is not proper research. What you have to go in is with a very analytical, intelligent, questioning mind. And it's very important to question everything in terms of not dismiss it, but the old reverse type thinking. The whole idea, is that true? Does that make sense? Does that fit into the bigger picture? And there's very few people that can do this because of their own personal prejudices. So it becomes a real problem. It's one thing that on my entire life is I've never really accepted anything ever told me, particularly in school, because, I looked at the world and some of the world's a mess, and you're saying this works and that. Well, how does all this? And it doesn't make sense. And generally, most of the things are done improperly and wrong. It's just that they've done that way for many years, and people continue to do it because they're really too ignorant to find better ways. But, that's never how anything grows or progresses or gets better. By doing the same old things that really don't work all that well forever because you can't think of anything better. So it takes a very questioning mind in general. You have to read between the lines. You have to also take, if you've been in a subject like I have for 40 years of research, almost 45 years of research, and you've looked at everything from this point of view of that, yeah, this is interesting, you're open, or that's information. And of course, I've talked about this before. It is just information. It's someone's opinion, and unless it's proven, we can't really tell. But, this book brings up and talks about, brings up a lot of issues and talks about occultists of American origin, particularly these fabled to the point of root men, and that's what they're called. There's a lot of information coming out from organizations that are teaching the so-called Hoodoo, usually a bunch of white people on top of it. As a matter of fact, the Jewish white Satanist who is pushing Hoodoo to make money off of it has absolutely no training whatsoever, and bases everything on the writings of a Christian minister who saw Harry Middleton, who was a racist and saw this as the demon's work, and for some reason got interested in folklore, and this was his thing. Then put together all these things to come up with some garbled nonsense and how this. But, it all works in if people looking for, the traditions and so forth. And I always tell people that the looking for traditions or pure traditions is the folly of the ignorant. There is absolutely no such thing as that, because magic is an art form. It is not a science, even though we are trying to make it as much as that as an occult scientist. But it's an art form which changes per person. But even so-called sciences, if you repaired cars, each mechanic kind of have a different way of doing things if they're a master, even though there are similarities to it all. And there are some of these similarities in occultism, but in general, when you get into these different areas, and particularly when you get into areas where there's a huge group of illiterate, low-educated people, and that haven't written things down, then you have to leave it up to the white man in that area, or some scholar, like so many grimoires are translated by college professors. I guess they got grants to do that, Well, I'm going to look into this old text. I'm going to need money to travel to Europe and stay there and look at the bookies. And, they get all these little fun little jobs they get to have that somebody's paying the ticket for. They aren't. And then, of course, they're going to give their college-educated Illuminati education based, and they're going to tell you what this book means because they have literal translations. And the literal translation is quite amusing because they don't have the background. Oh, well, I've read some books on occultism. I can figure it out pretty good. You can? I don't think so. Like, you can read a few books on occultism and you understand it. I read a book on how to do eye surgery, and I'm ready to go. So the whole idea is that all these types of things that you see out there, you have problems. So, there's been a controversy in the occult world against, and of course, nobody uses that term hoodoo hardly anywhere as well, which is interesting. There's even some, I should say, not nobody, but I mean, it's used in very tight circles. And what's interesting is that this particular book that covers a span here of many, many years doesn't use that term at all. It's called root this. It isn't hoodoo, which again seems to be a particular made-up word from maybe a particular group of practitioners. But this, and out of this entire book that talks about Southern witchcraft, which is what I've called it for years because it's such a conglomeration of things, doesn't ever use the word hoodoo. It uses the term voodoo, it uses the term witchcraft, root workers. And you can say, well, root workers are the same thing. Well, it isn't really the same thing, and let's get precise here. Hoodoo, a lot of people think is actually, and there's a book written on that it's actually a religion and not a magical practice. So, and we'll be reviewing that book that talks about that, and there's particular Southern dialects are even considered a original language, a Gula, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Gullah, which is actually a Southern language unto itself, which is a lot of how the Harry Middleton's books were written in this dialect, which is similar to English, but kind of a huge bastardization of it, where they've cut letters off, made things much more phonetic, and this isn't overly surprising. I mean, we have the hood talk, as we, the fascists and all this kind of things. So the whole idea is that what Snoop Dogg talks about on talk shows, and of course they have all these words that are made up for a particular group of people to understand, and while it isn't as complete throughout their language like the kind of talk that you will see from this particular dialect of English, which is quite different from regular English, even though is relatively recognizable. But when you start cutting out and words and pronouncing them as more they look, and you do all the things that to simplify it from a people who was not their native language, you kind of learned it, and then who were very uneducated, you get a very bizarre language that is difficult ultimately to figure out. And that's, of course, what was written down in the Middleton books, and to think that people would give out their secrets is just staggering. I've done an audio on that, which I recommend people look at as well. And but it is interesting because there is only the indigenous, and I guess you can't really call it indigenous magical systems, but basically when you get to America and you have the hoodoo, voodoo, and the other groups, and he talks about them pretty much by names. He doesn't, as he said, he does use that term, and he also tells you the difference between the root men and the voodoo, which he gives his insight into it. And what's interesting, the name of the book is, I don't think I covered this, 50 Years as a Low Country Witch Doctor by J.E. McTeer, and who basically is a white man from South Carolina who basically was a sheriff for, I believe, 28 or 30 years. And he was born in 1903. He died in 1979, which makes him 76 when he died. But, that's a very important time because, once things... the 70s were a very interesting time where there was a rebirth from white people into witchcraft and occultism to an extent that, they even had courses in witchcraft and studies in a lot of the major colleges. People have no idea what the huge boom occultism had in the 70s and how there were so many books and everything else on it. And then this became a huge rebound in the late 80s from the born-again Christians, the Reagan era, which really went out in the New Inquisition and stomped on all that and created a bunch of born-again psychotic Christians that wanted to demonize everybody. And who really are a nasty, scum-sucking group in general. Really nasty people, and I've known a lot of them, and even employed a couple for a period of time. Really got to see the kind of scumbucket, hateful people they are, and what freaks they are in general. But I don't want to diverse there. I'll save that for a juicy audio some other time. But this happened, of course, there was that birth of Wicca in the late 80s as well, where a huge group of people started moving in from traditional witchcraft into more of the different Wicca movements, which are all very, ultimately turned out to be very kind of gay movement that it has become today, a gay and lesbian movement, because people were looking for alternatives. And, of course, none of these people, particularly the great Wiccan women, wanted to do any of the real Wicca, which involved a lot of sex. So that was all cut out as well. How convenient. So the whole idea is that these realities that are out there in terms of the gossip that people want to tell you, particularly misinformed people that want to lead you into their business and whose alternative motives apparently are satanic practices, you have to be very careful of. Now, what is this guy? The reason this guy got involved in this whole area was the fact that being a police officer in South Carolina, and at these particular times, you're talking about, when it was very active in the 40s and 50s, when he was very active as a police. You got to remember, this was time before everything. People don't understand how crude everything was back then. You're talking about very few TV shows, no internet. These aren't a group of people who read things. So the entire class of particularly black people used witch doctors, and that's what they really used to call them, the root men, the witch doctor. And this came from, and there's a lot of little tidbits in the book that are very fascinating to go into, and I do recommend people get this book. I believe it's on Amazon in a print edition for $11.95. It's a $12 book. And of course, there's nothing practical in here, but in terms of for the average person too. There's a couple of things in there, and I'm going to tell you what they are in terms of practical techniques he talks about. But he completely shies away from that, and I will go into that as well. So the whole idea is he was in law enforcement, and it came to his notice, and of course there's a big use with the poor blacks at that time, who I'm sure were victimized as usual, that there was a lot going around in the communities and everything else, and that was his excuses is that there was he considers root work which is strange. And the book is very confusing and jumps in and out from different statements and different belief systems, from him being a Christian to him calling root work satanic, and then him being basically the white Christian who only deals in removing curses, not putting them on or doing other stuff, and all these things, and talks about the practices and how the root bags are made and the roots come from and what all this stuff is. And when they call root men, it's because they actually used a lot of roots. There's John the Conqueror is a famous root, but there's a whole bunch of roots, and these are outlined in the traditional sorcery course, because the entire lore of hoodoo and voodoo and witchcraft in general has been combined into that, and we've taken all those formulas and laid them out in the course. And of course, we make hybrid formulas of that as well over time, because a lot of this old stuff is good, concrete bottom of the pyramid, but times have changed, and there's a lot of things to be added and ways of doing things that you can improve upon these base formulas that have been around for years. So he saw these things happening, and there were complaints going on as well. A lot of people don't, using the term witch doctor is very important because of the fact that it denotes a medical reality. Now, poor people never been able to afford doctors. It's not much new even today, obviously. And there was a tradition here, and you got to remember that, the Civil War was in, and I'm terrible with dates, but it was around 1860, 1850, and it went on for 5 or 6 years. So you're talking about, and let me check that just to get the exact figures here. The internet is so handy-dandy. You're talking about 1861 to 1865, so it doesn't even go for 5 years, it went for 4 years. But what people don't look at is they don't understand numbers very well. And it's very interesting when you talk about even religion, how old they are and so forth. The people don't quite understand how new religions are, particularly Islam, which is only 1,500 years old. But people don't understand these things. You're talking about this only went on for 4 years, and of course there's a terrible toll. Some battles where 50,000 people were killed in one battle. You're talking about less than 100 years, 1965, where still have not much has changed. And particularly in the South, where everything really, there was a war, and like typical with American military leadership, it's over, that's it. Nothing goes on past that. They've been doing that kind of nonsense for the last 200 years. So nothing was really changed. So the cultural aspect, and you don't have satellites, you don't have internet, you're lucky if you have a good library in town, and then of course you're going to have reading skills. And I remember growing up in high school when there still was a huge illiteracy rate. You don't hear that much anymore, but there must be a lot of people that can't read, and as we get a more Latin population, I'm assuming this is going to skyrocket, but there's a lot of people who were illiterate. And I believe there was talk about in the 70s that 25% of the population was illiterate. And these were people living in poor farming communities around the country, and particularly down south, where there wasn't the opportunities or even the need to actually necessarily have proper school education. So if you look at the time elements here, and of course, there wasn't any kind of equality or start of equality for blacks until 1965, which is 100 years after the Civil War, where all of these things started to happen. So if you live down south, and it seems to be the case even to some extent, even today, but people lived in their own little communities, and they didn't have really much opportunities or choice to get out of these things. So there becomes, and there's so many people, and particularly alternative occultists and pagans, they want to go back to their culture and they reject a modern society. And they can do this because they have money and form their own little groups. Back then, you pretty much, if you were black, you had no choice. So you were living in this black community, this black reality, and as such, you have your own particular traditions and practices. After all, they were segregated, they were murdered, they were pushed together, they were given any opportunities, similar to what the British do to the Irish for 600 years, where they wouldn't let them to read, and then, of course, occupy a part of the country still today. But we're fighting in the Middle East. We should be fighting the Brits to get them out of Ireland. But that's okay. So the whole idea is that so you live in this very segmented community and a very illiterate populace, and people have their practices. I mean, people that come from certain cultures, and we see this very prominent today with the Mexicans who come to America, and they bring with them their brujas and their traditions and their candle lightings and their statues. So, they're holding that tradition. A lot of these people, and it's going to be pandemic in America of curses being cast on people as that population grows to the majority, which it will be another 10 or 20 years. So these things are going to be happening more and more, where these kind of practices are done and put on people. And they stay within their community and they go to their places. It's a very segmented world, and that's how it's always been. There's always been parts of cities where people gather, We've heard these things, Little Chinatown, Little Italy, these kind of things. People like to be with their own people. And within those areas, they have their own culture. And part of having that is maybe having your own Italian deli and your Italian restaurants and maybe an Italian import store. But part of that comes a cultural thing. And if you're black, you're going to have your witch doctor who came over with the groups of people. And it's all very, when you get into all these things, and I could spend hours talking about the process of how people were brought over here and everything else, but we don't want to turn this into 50 different audios. It's probably going to take a few to get through this book anyway. So he was I've diversed, as I usually do. So he was a police officer, and there's a lot of complaints, and there's all this cursing and going on. As usual, the most popular area in most practices with people tend to be the cursing of your enemies, the attacking of your enemy. I mean, these are things that are very typical. In terms of being the areas that people want to get justice, and particularly in a community where there is no justice. You go to the white man who's going to tell you nonsense and not help you, you're going to go to your witch doctor. But the witch doctor served as just that. He was a doctor. So, meaning he was a medical doctor, and he gave you different cures, and where he came from, originally in Africa, they would actually heal you, and the actual medical doctors were the witch doctors, as well as them doing spiritual and occult things for you. So, he became aware of these because what was happening was there was an uproar, and I don't know how many people died or not, that the witch doctors, the root men, and these areas are extremely profitable, by the way, because they had such a following, and people would bring them cash and supported these people, and you have so many people coming to you for everything, including physical medical treatments, that it was a very profitable area. And what they did find is when he investigated some of these people and even arrested them, is he found large amounts of money on them, which they apparently didn't even bother doing anything with. I guess, when you're that poor, what are you supposed to do? And how are you going to, go out and buy yourself a Cadillac is going to be quite obvious if you buy yourself a nice house somewhere. So the problem is, when you have a lot of money when you're really poor and you're not supposed to have that money, what do you even do with it? So it doesn't appear like they even cared about the money because it became strange in itself. And of course, they didn't have the education and smarts to take that money somewhere else. And you got to remember, this is different times. When you're talking about the 40s and 50s, I mean, there wasn't even interstate roads built until the 50s. People don't understand. It was after World War II that you could even drive around the United States. There wasn't that many, or I should say, interstate highways. So there was a lot of tiny little roads leading everywhere. And another thing that people, just don't understand how things are today compared to how they were even the short time ago when you look at going back a measly 60, 100 years. How things have radically changed. But even in the last 40 years, things have dramatically changed. Pretty much every phase of your common life has changed, and then we've radical changes with the internet and buying things, etc. But that's radically changed lifestyles and accessibility to goods. So it came to his attention because there were these complaints. And I don't know if they were coming from doctors. I don't know if people were dying. I'm sure if all of that was happening. But of course, there was a major push against the occultist root men who were practicing medicine. And as such, were stepping on the toes of an area that regular society wouldn't stand. And them not being very qualified in this area, they really were at this particular stage in southern America. These people were not really herbists. They would give people strange concoctions, oftentimes poisons, which would upset the body, sometimes creating healings. But they weren't really what we consider the old witch, making up herbal things and using healing things as a general rule. So a lot of it was con stuff where they would give you different drinks of this and that, and these would either give you diarrhea, make you vomit. And of course, these are all ways to purge out illnesses. Or out of you, and as such, by giving people these types of illegal medicines, this was something that the police were interested in and wanted to stop because this was obviously regulated by law. I'm sure that the doctors wanted to bring the black patients in. They were losing a lot of money. If you live in a black neighborhood and everybody's going to the witch doctor and you're the doctor, well, you're going to lose a lot of money that way. And secondly, most likely their practices in this particular area wasn't all that good and helpful, and probably a lot of people died because of it. But we don't know again. Now, the problem with all research... The problem with research into anything alternative is the fact that you can't get any credible information. And when it comes to healing, since it's illegal to heal people with medical conditions, we don't know what works and doesn't work. There's huge amounts of different tools out there. People who sell frequency machines, zappers, radionics. Well, we don't know if this works. Everybody says it does work, and of course, the underground movement is that, oh yeah, all this stuff works, that's why it's suppressed. Well, we don't know, and from my testing, it is far from an effective treatment. And can be very, very expensive for something that may not give you any benefits at all. So we just don't know in those areas because there isn't much information on it. Basically, somebody makes something, says it works, and that's what you are going on the faith of that person, that he's not going to sell you something that is worthless. Well, I haven't found that much to be the truth either. They're a business, and they're going to tell you whatever they feel like telling you. So to sell product, and they will even convince themselves it does work when there is no credibility behind it whatsoever. So this was a big problem, and he was called in to investigate this. He also noticed the activities that go on, which was chewing the root during trials. You would have your own personal... of course, I've recommended this to people before. I mean, if you had a team of psychics to go into you in court and would use psychic influencing on the people there, it seems to me that's a very smart thing to do in a particular fashion. So the whole idea for court cases or any time else, and it seems to be a very overlooked area for those people to give that edge, and certainly would be worth the investment. But so people would come in there, it's called chewing the root, and you would actually chew a special root as a root man, and this would generate energy in favor of your client who is in front of a judge. He also found many people powdering the courtroom, powdering different areas where people would sit and so forth. And this is classic voodoo stuff and witchcrafty stuff in general, which is covered again in the traditional sorcery course. And there are powders you make for these types of things, for influencing people, bosses, everybody. There are powders you sprinkle in different areas. This is classic Southern witchcraft, as he uses the term, and how I've used the term before in other lectures, and I think that's a great way to give it a kind of bigger label, and then, of course, there's a bunch of offshoots of that particular type. So he was called in to investigate, and these kind of areas, and went after. Another reason why these people couldn't talk, the minute the gossip got around and he got informants that came to him and told him what was going on with these different root men, particularly when it came to people taking what's considered medicine or potions, and some of them not for illnesses. And I'll give you a case here which is quite interesting. He starts that he was then called in and actually prosecuted several of these root men and threw them in jail for practicing medicine without a license. You couldn't get them for a cult. But some of these issues weren't a cult either. And it is very interesting how he got involved with this. So being in this area and being in these poor neighborhoods of South Carolina and being a sheriff for 28 years, I believe, 28 or 30 years. And the only way that he could basically control the black populace and make sure that he could have something over them, because they basically lived by a different law, and they followed their root men. They followed their root men, which were basically their tribal leaders, the people in the community who they went to with all their problems, and they were in control. And the only way that he could then get control and move in there and be dominant over this entire culture was to become a witch doctor himself, and at least tell everybody he was a great, powerful witch doctor, and then influence him that way, because they didn't really take him seriously or what he was doing if he was not a part of their community. But after all, these are a black community. He's a white man, but he's not just a white man. He's just not a doctor. He's not just some other person in the community, a politician. This guy is a guy with a lot of power because he's a cop. And they can do whatever they please. And this is not anything that is new. And so people were wary of the police because they could get arrested and thrown in jail. And these root men were. And some of the activities of these root men became very prominent to them, that they're people that were supposedly committing crimes, doing all sorts of things, and these root men were getting them off somehow. Well, there seems to be little proof of that, really, but they were prescribing where he could then go after these people so that he could move in and control them, taking out the leaders of the communities, is that they were practicing medicine of some sort. And this is something that he was set about to stop them with, but this is also the way that he could get them, was this excuse for that. So this was something that he decided to get involved with it, and of course, all these things of people dying and all the curses that were put on them was something he constantly had to deal with as a sheriff, because these things were happening and he was interacting with these people, and these subjects would come up, and then they would talk about different people and how powerful they were. So he decided somehow that he was going to himself become a witch doctor. Now, what's interesting about witch doctors and how they got to the United States is that if you were a practicing witch doctor in Africa and you fell out of favor with the leader, or basically if your magic didn't work, you were then sold into slavery. And what few people don't understand is most black people sold other black people into slavery, particularly competing tribes or tribes they captured. They would actually sell them into slavery, which was a common practice at that time. And the Arabs, who ran most of the slavery throughout Africa, who invaded and took over North Africa, almost all of it, of course, was heavily involved, as the good Muslims they were, in slave trading. So if you were a bad witch doctor, you were generally sold into slavery and you ended up in America, which is very interesting. Again, it goes back to research. It's kind of frightening to think that, 1,000 years from now, if someone finds a occult book, that they'll find one of the mass-marketed books produced by, written by, Scott Cunningham, or if they really are unlucky, by E.A. Conetting, and they get this garbagey, junky as crap occultism that there is, and this is then considered real occultism. So, this is the problem: is that these people come over here that were basically sold into slavery, or their parents or whatever, and it's hard to connect these things exact time levels, but basically they came to America, and you're talking about before the Civil War, because they were failures. So that's very interesting and something probably people don't understand. So, everybody had their particular witch doctor, and when they didn't, and when they weren't successful for one reason or another, they got rid of them. So basically the people that came here that then became leaders in the community were all people that were failures. So this became an attention to him, and as the white, educated policeman, he somehow wanted to point himself as the biggest, most powerful witch doctor in the area. And of course, it didn't help having guns and handcuffs and other police officers that will come and beat you and throw you in prison for the rest of your life. So everybody said, "Yes, sir, you are a great witch doctor." So I don't give this man much credit because of these particular things. So he decided to do that, and somehow got information from different people. I'm sure that he was supplied some because of his threats. And of course, you got to work for the police because, after all, as I've just said, they have extreme power. So one of the most prominent root people at that time, and they are root men. There was only men involved. Apparently, there weren't any root women. And as he said, he calls it Southern witchcraft, voodoo at some times, and root work. Never uses the term hoodoo, and doesn't use voodoo either, because these are kind of regional differences, but there are prominence differences in them. I'll tell you what he states they are as I go on here. But so there was a man called Dr. Buzzard, who still at this particular time there is a great what can I say? There's a lore. There's a lore that this was a great voodoo man, a great witch doctor, and could cause so many things. And apparently, he was brought to the attention of McTeer here because he was so active and he had so many clients, and that McTeer stated that he was going to go after Dr. Buzzard on every level, and because of this, or I should say root men in general as well, Dr. Buzzard decided to work against him. And of course, we must assume that that he was going to hex McTeer. So McTeer, hearing this, claimed to then respond himself with his own mojo, and some sort of magical battle is insinuated here from what he learned from I'm not sure whom. McTeer claims that his family were basic people who had a spiritualistic tint. His mother was a medium, I believe, and the grandmother had magic, but they really never practiced witchcraft. And, having psychic abilities and being a medium, of course, like all these people, they all claim this as giving them some right or some reason why they are talented. So he claims to have this ability passed on to him, which is why he's such a powerful root man. And I don't know who would, where he got his teaching, but so this little confrontation happened in the magical world, because I'm assuming he couldn't get him on anything legally, even though the giving of potions was something that Dr. Buzzard was doing as well, and he was basically going after him, and so he somehow did his own rituals. And what happened was the fact that Dr. Buzzard's son drove off the road one night into I believe it was a river, and died. And as such, that meant that this sheriff, this white sheriff who had just recently learned root work, was more powerful than the great Dr. Buzzard, who was the most powerful root man of his time and in that area. So this apparently convinced Dr. Buzzard that he has to work with McTeer. So apparently, as the story goes, McTeer came home one night, found Dr. Buzzard sitting in a car with 2 chickens, dead chickens, and gave them to McTeer. And I guess this was a way, because that was a way, I'm assuming, food is always a way of gifting somebody, particularly if you're poor, which is the reason why chickens were used in so many of these witchcraft or particularly hoodoo voodoo rituals, was because of the fact that people ate afterwards. So it wasn't just sacrificing the chicken, it was food, and you would give that to the person doing the ritual as well, and he had food. And that's just like money, because you're going to use money to buy food. So he gave him this, and Dr. Buzzard said, well, I know you have power, and I know I have power, and we ought to come to an agreement here and be friends. And so that's basically how the story went. And from that point on, supposedly, him and a few other root men, including Dr. Bug, I believe, decided to share with this white sheriff all their secrets and make him into root doctor. For what reason? I have no idea why you'd possibly give that out to that person. And at that particular time, Dr. Buzzard said he would stop giving people medical drinks, as they were called then, because it would always be some sort of drinkable potion, apparently. That he would stop giving people and treating them in this medical way, and that he agreed to do that. But he did not agree to stop hexing people, because that's where the money was, to deal with to remove hexes and to put hexes on was pretty much the big profitable area of the root men. So, very, very interesting. So that's how the story, and supposedly he poured his heart out to McTeer, trained him, and he became this great, which he considers himself the white witch doctor. And of course, since he was the educated professional police guy, and particularly in those days in the 60s and early 70s, while he was still active, with the great interest from the colleges and the media, that he got on TV, he was interviewed, So it was quite the thing back then. And as I said, most people can't understand that today, considering how things are so suppressed on the common media. But it wasn't like that for years ago. People of all types of credibility were involved in occultism, witchcraft, and UFOs and everything else. You're talking about, college professors, scientists, and a variety of governmental and police officials were all involved in this. It was quite common, and there wasn't this great religious uproar at that time, apparently. I'm sure it was not supported, but it wasn't like which came in the 80s with the Reagan people of the this radical want to kill you, all Satanists are evil attitude, which is perpetrated to this day. So, but is this the case? Did he learn anything? Was he given anything? What was all this that was going on? Of course, they had to work with him, and of course, it would be smart of Dr. Buzzard to come and talk with this guy. He had the power. He was out to get the root men. And people would say, well, if he was such a hexer and so great about that, and people talk about this today in terms of the fact of magically killing people. Yes, it is very possible and can be done. The problem is what does that cause you in terms of problems? If this was well known that Dr. Buzzard was in conflict with this guy, if he was to die, I'm sure that the white Christian law enforcement establishment would have went after Dr. Buzzard and killed him one way or another, or trumped up charges on him. I mean, let's face it, this is done all the time from all the big scandals just came out recently with the great credible FBI who did this for 20 years, where they set up people and arrange things. And of course, local police departments have been doing it from the beginning of time. So, just going in there and cursing somebody to death is what people think the way things happen. Can cause you problems. If you're linked to something, they may not be able to get you directly, but they'll figure out some way to get you indirectly. So it's not as easy as people think. So smiling and working with somebody is a smart thing to do. Now, arming this enemy with any serious or practical information you have to wonder, because these are secrets in general. One person doesn't give the secrets of the other. And all these, it's within these communities is that, and there were competition between root men, that all of these techniques that you had were kept to yourself personally. And they were passed generally from generation to generation. Your family member, particularly your son, would learn this. And this would be passed down. And this is very much talked about even to this day, but in certain situations when you ask people how do they get their power, particularly southern voodoo people, it's all family and the spirits they work with. So the spirits make them powerful, and of course this is family. It comes from blood. It's in your DNA. And there seems to be some that, mommy was a witch, granddaddy was a witch, whatever it is. There seems to be this transfer of particular power, and that this is why you're special. And this is still done today in a whole bunch of areas, that people seem to think that they have something special. They have some ability that comes from them that's built into them. And of course, that comes also with the fact that you're able to commune with powerful spirits that are your allies, and you have made connections with and work with, and that's where you get your great power. So he claims to be extremely powerful and have the best and most powerful that there was, because he trained from everybody and developed it, and because Mama was a medium and had some psychic abilities and drank them mint juleps, transferred all this energy into him, and he's now this big, powerful sheriff. So, wisely, Dr. Buzzard and a few others worked with this guy, at least to some extent, because he would go to them and talk to them, of course, under the threat of, the implied threat, I got a gun, I'm the sheriff, I can bring you in. So the whole idea is that you can remember that that's there. So there's a certain working together. But, when you read his book here, that it really, and none of that he's ever written has he put down any practical information, you have to really wonder what was passed on and what validity was there. And he makes no... he writes throughout the book here how he equates all these witchcraft practices with black magic, with Satanism, plain and simple, because it's an alternative religion, so it has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. He doesn't really mention the church in there, but we've got to understand this guy must have been going to the local church. He must have been a Christian. I mean, it's built into Southern society. It's hard to believe that you could be elected sheriff for 29 or 30 terms if you weren't a member of the local church. So he's got to be a member of a local church, whatever that may be. And of course, he's dealing with the devil to do God's work. But he goes, one of the problems, and of course, the book is so contradictory of saying how powerful this is and then him saying how not powerful it is. But it is pretty confusing throughout the entire book as he goes from this and then saying how, well, since poor people can't afford psychiatrists, that we need witch doctors to help them. So, since you can't get a psychiatrist, you go to a witch doctor because the witch doctors are cheaper. So, these are the type of things that, what? What do you mean? Magic works or doesn't it work? Basically saying, well, if you can't afford a psychiatrist, then go to a witch doctor. That don't make any sense to me whatsoever. But this is going to turn into a long discussion here. It's an important area to go into here, and I'm going to pick that up in part 2 of this.